early life. In the far reaches of the countryside, where the first rays of sun kissed the river in gold, there lay a village that time seemed to forget, Iloto. Narrow paths wound between wooden huts patched with palm leaves. The air smelled of wet earth, cooking fires, and the faint tang of river water. Children's laughter echoed across the fields, but beneath it all were whispers. Secrets carried by the wind, rumors older than most could remember. Among this ordinary, sleepy village lived a boy named Aderin. His name meant one who becomes special, but the villagers had yet to see it. At first glance, Aderin looked unremarkable. Clothes too large, patched sandals flapping with every step, freckles scattered across his cheeks that made him blend into the sunlit streets. Yet beneath his quiet demeanor, a fire burned. His parents were gone. His mother died before he could hear her lullabies. His father's name was a shadow he barely remembered. Left to distant relatives who treated him as a burden, Aderin learned early that kindness was temporary, and survival required more than courage. It required attention. While other children ran and laughed freely, he watched. He noticed the small things. The way villagers tilted their heads in conversation, how the louder voices always commanded attention, how small gestures revealed deeper truths. The children were cruel in subtle ways. They called him Empty Hand because he had nothing, and Wind Walker because he seemed to glide past trouble without confronting it. At first, he tried to fight back, but laughter and bruises only reminded him of his weakness. Slowly, he stopped resisting. He learned that observation, patience, and silence could be stronger than fists. Even Baba Kunnal, the village elder, noticed him. One evening, leaning on his staff, Baba Kunnal muttered, "The quiet ones. They see what we do not." Watching Aderin help a younger child carry firewood, the old man nodded. Patience sits heavy on him, but it will carry him far. Aderin overheard and simply smiled, letting the words settle quietly into his heart. Life in Iloto was measured by possessions, land, and connections. Aderin had none. Yet, he discovered something the villagers did not yet understand. Strength was not always loud. Power often grew in silence. As the sun dipped below the river, painting the sky in orange and violet, Aderin sat at the water's edge. He whispered to himself, "One day, they will understand. One day, they will see." The boy who had nothing was already learning to become someone who could never be ignored. Life in Iloto was harsh, especially for someone like Aderin. The village rewarded loud voices and visible strength, not quiet intelligence. Every morning brought the clamor of merchants shouting prices, children playing, and elders commanding attention. Amidst this chaos, Aderin moved like a shadow, careful and deliberate, unseen yet observing everything. The children tested him daily. "Empty hand, Wind Walker," they would cry. When his sandals got stuck in the mud, they laughed. The sting in his chest was sharp, but he forced a smile, hiding frustration he did not yet know how to name. He began to notice patterns. Who laughed first, who led the others, who hid behind someone else. Observation became his secret strength. His only companions were the river and the few animals brave enough to approach him. Sometimes he spoke to the river. "Will anyone ever see me for who I am? Or am I meant to vanish like the morning mist?" In these conversations, Aderin learned patience. Quietly, he began to understand the rhythm of people. The way anger flared, how envy crept into smiles, and how small acts could betray hidden intentions. School under the large baobab tree was no refuge. Teachers favored children with connections. Aderin's correct answers often went ignored. His whispers of clarification were met with ridicule. Yet he persisted. Every ignored answer, every mockery, was another thread in his growing understanding of the world. Samuel the steward, a man of authority, noticed Aderin's quiet nature. One afternoon, he called the boy forward. "Why do you always linger at the edges? Do you think silence makes you important?" Aderin bowed his head, replying softly, "No, sir. I am just learning." Samuel laughed, cold and hollow. "The world is not kind to quiet ones." Inside, Aderin catalogued every tone, glance, and whispered comment. He noted the steward's influence, how people obeyed him even when wrong, how power was often misused. This knowledge became a quiet strength, invisible to all but himself. He observed his peers too. Kemi, with her sharp eyes and clever words, negotiated games and conflicts with skill. Teo, loud and boastful, often faltered under scrutiny. Each interaction was a lesson. The patterns of human behavior, the currency of attention, the subtle ways power worked in small communities. At night, lying on his thin mat, Aderin imagined faraway places. Cities with towering buildings, bustling markets, people driven by ambition. Every day he promised himself, "One day, I will return." Not as the boy they ignore, but as someone they cannot overlook. Baba Kunal watched quietly. "He sees more than we allow," he muttered. "Patience sits heavy on him, but one day it will carry him far." Aderin heard nothing, but he felt it. A quiet approval, a recognition that the world might one day bend to patience and silent understanding. Through ridicule, observation, and silent determination, Aderin learned the most important lessons of his youth. Silence is strength, observation is power, and patience is a weapon. The boy who had nothing was already building the foundation to become someone the world could not ignore. Life in Ilodo was harsh, especially for someone like Aderin. The village rewarded loud voices and visible strength, not quiet intelligence. Every morning brought the clamor of merchants shouting prices, children playing, and elders commanding attention. Amidst this chaos, Aderin moved like a shadow, careful and deliberate, unseen yet observing everything. The children tested him daily. "Empty hand, wind walker," they would cry. When his sandals got stuck in the mud, they laughed. The sting in his chest was sharp, but he forced a smile, hiding frustration he did not yet know how to name. He began to notice patterns. Who laughed first, who led the others, who hid behind someone else. Observation became his secret strength. His only companions were the river and the few animals brave enough to approach him. Sometimes he spoke to the river. "Will anyone ever see me for who I am? Or am I meant to vanish like the morning mist?" In these conversations, Aderin learned patience. Quietly, he began to understand the rhythm of people. The way anger flared, how envy crept into smiles, and how small acts could betray hidden intentions. School under the large baobab tree was no refuge. Teachers favored children with connections. Aderin's correct answers often went ignored. His whispers of clarification were met with ridicule. Yet he persisted. Every ignored answer, every mockery, was another thread in his growing understanding of the world. Samuel the steward, a man of authority, noticed Aderin's quiet nature. One afternoon, he called the boy forward. "Why do you always linger at the edges? Do you think silence makes you important?" Aderin bowed his head, replying softly, "No, sir. I am just learning." Samuel laughed, cold and hollow. "The world is not kind to quiet ones." Inside, Aderin catalogued every tone, glance, and whispered comment. He noted the steward's influence, how people obeyed him even when wrong, how power was often misused. This knowledge became a quiet strength, invisible to all but himself. He observed his peers too. Kemi, with her sharp eyes and clever words, negotiated games and conflicts with skill. Teo, loud and boastful, often faltered under scrutiny. Each interaction was a lesson. The patterns of human behavior, the currency of attention, the subtle ways power worked in small communities. At night, lying on his thin mat, Aderin imagined faraway places. Cities with towering buildings, bustling markets, people driven by ambition. Every day he promised himself, "One day, I will return." Not as the boy they ignore, but as someone they cannot overlook. Baba Kunal watched quietly. "He sees more than we allow," he muttered. "Patience sits heavy on him, but one day it will carry him far." Aderin heard nothing, but he felt it. A quiet approval, a recognition that the world might one day bend to patience and silent understanding. Through ridicule, observation, and silent determination. Aderin learned the most important lessons of his youth. Silence is strength, observation is power, and patience is a weapon. The sun had climbed high over Iloto, scattering warmth across the village and making the river sparkle like fractured glass. Market day had arrived, and the village square was alive with the chatter of merchants, the clatter of baskets, and the scent of roasted yam and fresh fish. Aderin moved quietly among the throng, balancing a small bundle of fruits he had been entrusted to deliver. Each step was careful, practiced, almost invisible. Yet his eyes were alive, observing every motion, every expression, every whisper. Children ran past him, laughing and shouting, while elders haggled over prices. For a moment, it seemed ordinary, until a sharp, panicked cry broke the rhythm of the marketplace. "Thief! Someone stole the money!" The words hit Aderin like a stone. He froze, holding the basket tightly to his chest. Around him, a crowd began to form, eyes darting toward the chaos. At the center stood Samuel the steward, his face twisted in anger, pointing a trembling finger at Aderin. "You, boy with no sense," Samuel barked. "I saw you near the chest. You took the money." A hush fell over the square. Aderin's heart raced, each beat echoing like a drum in his chest. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, but the words caught in his throat. The villagers were already murmuring, some nodding as if confirmation were not needed, others wide-eyed with shock. "You always linger at the edges, thinking you're clever," Samuel continued, his voice rising. "But now we see who you really are." Aderin's mind raced. He knew he had done nothing wrong. He had delivered the fruits, as instructed. But no proof mattered. The village had learned long ago that loud accusations often carried more weight than truth. His stomach twisted with fear and humiliation, but he remembered the lessons he had learned in silence. Observe, wait, survive. "Kemi!" he called softly, his voice almost drowned by the murmurs. "Teo! Someone can tell the truth." Kemi, bright-eyed and sharp, looked uncertain. Teo shuffled his feet, glancing nervously at the crowd. Neither spoke. The villagers' gaze remained fixed on Aderin, heavy with expectation, judgment, and a cruel satisfaction. Samuel stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Aderin's small frame. "No one will defend the boy who has nothing. Not today. Not ever." The words cut deeper than any slap. Aderin felt a burning sting behind his eyes but forced himself to stand straight. He clutched the basket to his chest, the fruits trembling with each breath. He wanted to scream, to strike, to run. But he remembered the river, the quiet of the night, the whispered promises he made to himself. Patience is strength. Observation is power. And so he did the only thing he could. He bowed his head, silent but not broken. The villagers, sensing his submission, let their attention shift. Some whispered, some laughed. Kemi's eyes flickered with unease. Teo's face turned pale. Even Baba Kunnal, standing at the edge of the square, could not intervene immediately. The boy had been trapped, and justice, if it existed, was drowned in the clamor of power and fear. By evening, the accusation had spread like wildfire. Aderin found himself isolated, not just in the market but in his own home, which offered little comfort. Each glance from a neighbor, each half-hearted greeting, reminded him that the world had judged him before listening, that the strong always dictated the narrative. That night, as rain began to fall in soft, persistent drops, Aderin sat outside, watching the river swell and swirl with the current. He felt the sting of humiliation, the sharp taste of injustice, but also a quiet resolve growing inside him. He whispered to the river, his trusted confidant, "They think this ends me. They do not yet know. I am only beginning." Baba Kunnal found him there, leaning on his staff. "The boy has spirit," he said, voice low. "Do not let this break you. One day, they will see the strength in silence." Aderin nodded silently, letting the words sink. He understood with a clarity born of suffering. that the world would not hand him justice. He would have to earn it, quietly, patiently, and unobserved. And so, with the rain washing the village paths and the market now empty, Aderin made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would leave Iloto not in defeat, but in preparation. Every humiliation, every insult, every betrayal was a lesson. Every whisper and glare would be remembered, catalogued, and transformed into strategy. The night Aderin left Iloto, the village slept under a blanket of stars, unaware that one of its own was quietly vanishing. He carried nothing but a small satchel of belongings, a few clothes, some coins given reluctantly by a sympathetic neighbor, and a notebook in which he had written his observations, his thoughts, and the lessons he could not yet act upon. Each step on the narrow path out of the village felt like both a farewell and an awakening. He did not run. He walked with purpose. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the gentle lap of the river against the banks, was a guide, reminding him that the world was larger than the narrow opinions of those who had judged him. Every humiliation, every whispered insult, had been catalogued and stored, waiting for a moment when they would transform into understanding, strategy, and eventually power. The first days beyond Iloto were harsh. He slept under trees, ate what he could forage, and traded small skills for food, running errands for villagers in nearby settlements, repairing broken tools, and helping merchants organize goods. Each experience, no matter how small, became a lesson. He learned that survival demanded more than patience. It required creativity, adaptability, and courage. In these early days, Aderin discovered the complexity of people. Some were kind in unexpected ways. A woman who offered him a bowl of stew without asking for anything in return. A merchant who taught him how to calculate profit margins from a pile of goods. Others were harsh, cruel, or greedy, showing him the full spectrum of human behavior. With each encounter, he sharpened his understanding of trust, deception, and influence. One evening, as he sat beside a small fire, a traveling trader named Mr. Adewale noticed him observing the villagers quietly. Unlike the others, this man did not approach Aderin with suspicion or judgment. Instead, he asked simple questions, guiding the boy's curiosity. "Why do you watch so carefully, boy?" Adewale asked. Aderin hesitated but replied honestly, "I want to understand. To know why people do what they do, even when it seems unfair." The trader smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Understanding comes before power. Patience comes before influence. Remember that." These words struck deep, and for the first time, Aderin felt that someone understood the purpose behind his silence, his observation, and his meticulous attention to detail. From that night forward, he began to record not only his observations but also strategies for action, though he had yet to act. Months passed and Aderin grew stronger, not just in body, but in mind. He learned basic commerce, the value of currency, and how small investments could ripple outward. He studied the patterns of markets, human behavior, and influence. He began to see opportunities where others only saw chaos. Each lesson, each observation, was a step toward the person he was meant to become. A far cry from the boy the villagers once mocked. And yet, despite the progress, a quiet homesickness lingered. He thought of Iloto with complicated feelings. Love for the land that shaped him, resentment for the cruelty he endured, and curiosity about the village that would never know the lessons it had unknowingly taught him. Every night, he whispered to the river he once knew, "I will return, not as the boy you ignored, but as someone you cannot forget." It was during this period of solitude and learning that Aderin first began to dream bigger than survival. He imagined infrastructure, trade, wealth, and influence, not for pride, but for understanding, respect, and power that could never be taken lightly. He realized that patience, observation, and strategic action were his true weapons. By the end of his first year away from Iloto, Aderin was no longer the boy with empty hands. He had gained knowledge, skills, and a quiet confidence that could not be measured by coins or possessions. In the shadows of cities, along rivers, and in the marketplaces he frequented, he observed patterns, noting who thrived and who faltered, who lied easily, and who commanded respect. In solitude, Aderin prepared for a future only he could see. A future where the boy who had been mocked would rise, not through vengeance alone, but through understanding, planning, and the quiet accumulation of power. Every insult, every slight, every humiliation endured in Iloto became a brick in the foundation of the man he was destined to become. And though no one in Iloto suspected it, the boy who walked away under the cover of night was already beginning a journey that would one day reshape the village itself, leaving whispers and questions in his wake. Who is he now? And how did he rise so silently? Months passed since Aderin left Iloto, yet the village still felt his absence, though no one could pinpoint why. The marketplace seemed quieter, less chaotic, yet something had begun to shift. Aderin, now older and wiser, watched from afar. He returned not as the boy they once mocked, but as a quiet force, unseen yet shaping the world he had left behind. He began small. A coin here, a gift there, delivered through intermediaries or left anonymously. A tiny loan to the woman who ran the village bakery allowed her to expand her stall. A new well dug in secret provided clean water to families who had long struggled. These acts were subtle, almost invisible, yet they left ripples through the village. People whispered of miracles, but none suspected the boy they had shunned. Baba Kunnal noticed first. Sitting outside his hut one evening, he watched villagers benefiting from unexplained generosity. Something stirs in Iloto, but what? He muttered, scratching his beard. The boy? Could it be him? The old man's eyes gleamed with curiosity and a hint of pride. He had always seen potential in Aderin, even when others did not. But he could not yet confirm the boy's return. Meanwhile, Aderin observed the villagers carefully, cataloging reactions to each subtle intervention. He noted who showed gratitude, who suspected trickery, and who remained oblivious. Each observation was a lesson in human nature, a reminder that influence was as much about perception as action. Even Samuel, the steward who had accused him falsely, could not ignore the changes. Shops seemed busier, trade smoother, and families healthier. Yet he could not trace these improvements to any single person. Suspicion and curiosity gnawed at him, though he dared not speak it aloud. Aderin's own satisfaction was quiet, almost invisible. He did not seek applause or recognition. Instead, he reveled in understanding the subtle power of influence without declaration. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and patient. Each small success built confidence, each observation strengthened his insight, and each hidden contribution became a foundation for the greater plans he had yet to reveal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Aderin watched the village from a distant hill. Children played along the riverbank, merchants counted coins in their stalls, and the air smelled of wet earth and roasting yams. The boy they once ignored had become a quiet architect of change. And yet, Aderin was not content with mere benevolence. Each act of generosity was also a test, a way to understand human nature, to study patterns, and to identify those capable of loyalty, honesty, or cunning. Kemi's family, for example, benefited quietly, and he noted her discreet gratitude. Teyo's family, on the other hand, received aid but responded with suspicion and entitlement. Every reaction added to his growing knowledge of the village's social fabric. Baba Kunnal, still watching from his porch, finally spoke aloud to himself. He has returned, but he walks unseen. Patience, observation, and quiet strength. This boy has learned well. Aderin's strategy was deliberate. He was laying the groundwork for influence that would one day be undeniable. The village would not see him coming, yet everything they experienced, from improved wells to thriving shops, would eventually lead them to one undeniable truth. The boy who had been nothing was quietly becoming everything. And as the first stars twinkled above Iloto, Aderin whispered to himself, a smile playing across his lips. They think this is chance. They think this is luck. One day, they will understand the power of patience, the strength of silence, and the quiet rise of the unseen. Iloto began to change in ways that could no longer be ignored. What started as small improvements slowly became undeniable patterns. Trade routes became more active. Merchants from nearby towns began stopping by more frequently. Prices stabilized. Even the roads, once uneven and forgotten, were subtly repaired, stone by stone, without any public announcement. And then a name began to circulate. Not shouted, not announced, whispered. Mr. Adewale. No one knew exactly who he was. Some said he was a businessman from the city. Others claimed he was a representative of wealthy investors. A few believed he was merely a myth, an explanation the villagers invented to make sense of their sudden fortune. But Baba Kunnal knew better. He had seen that name before. Years ago, on the lips of a traveling trader who once sat by the fire with a quiet boy who watched more than he spoke. Aderin now moved under that name, Mr. Adewale, not as a disguise but as a shield. He understood something most people never learned. Power revealed too early attracts resistance. So he stayed invisible, operating through trusted hands, careful intermediaries, and written instructions that left no trace of emotion or ego. He dressed simply when he visited the outskirts of the village. Clean clothes, calm posture, steady eyes. No gold, no loud confidence, just quiet certainty. People felt it before they understood it. When Mr. Adewale spoke, he did not raise his voice. Yet people leaned in. When he offered suggestions, elders listened. When he invested, results followed. And still, no one recognized him. Not even those who once mocked Aderin. Samuel the steward felt it first, the discomfort. His authority no longer carried the same weight. Merchants questioned his decisions. Elders bypassed him when discussing village improvements. And worst of all, no one could explain why. One afternoon, as he argued with a trader over new pricing structures, the man shrugged and said, "That's not how Mr. Adewale advised we do it." The name struck Samuel like a slap. "Who is this man?" he snapped. "Since when does some outsider tell us how to run our affairs?" But deep down, fear crept in, because things were working, and Samuel was no longer in control. Aderin watched it all quietly, from a distance, from the shadows, from positions where power could be measured, not displayed. He studied reactions the same way he once studied playground bullies and marketplace whispers. He noted who adapted, who resisted, who grew bitter, and who grew wiser. Every human response followed patterns, and Aderin had learned how to read them. Yet, despite his growing influence, he remained deeply human. Some nights, alone, he still felt the weight of his past. The false accusation, the humiliation, the silence of friends who never defended him. He would sit quietly, staring at the dark, asking himself, "Am I becoming powerful or just careful?" The answer came not in words, but in discipline. He refused to act from anger. He refused to seek revenge loudly. He refused to expose himself before the foundation was complete. Because he knew something Ilodo did not yet understand. True power is patient. Baba Kunnal finally confirmed his suspicion during a quiet evening meeting. Mr. Adewale had sent a message, written in simple, careful handwriting, requesting the elder's opinion on a long-term investment plan for the village. The words were familiar, the tone unmistakable. Baba Kunnal's hands trembled slightly as he whispered to himself, "It is you, isn't it, my boy?" He smiled, not with surprise, but with pride. The seed had grown. Meanwhile, whispers spread beyond Ilodo. Nearby towns began speaking of a young, disciplined investor whose influence reshaped struggling communities without chaos or conflict. Someone who never chased attention, yet controlled outcomes. Someone whose wealth was rumored to be vast, but whose lifestyle remained simple. No one could trace his beginnings. No one knew his true story, except one old man, and one quiet river. As Aderin stood overlooking Ilodo one evening, watching the glow of lanterns and the movement of lives he had once belonged to, he spoke softly. "They still see results, but not the source. That's good, because the truth will hit harder when it finally arrives." And somewhere deep within him, the boy who once had nothing stood taller. Not because he was wealthy now, but because he had mastered patience, restraint, and the long game. Alodo gathered on a morning that felt heavier than usual. The sun rose, but the air carried a strange tension, like the village itself knew something was about to change. Elders sat in a wide circle near the marketplace. Merchants stood behind their stalls, pretending to work while listening closely. Children were unusually quiet. A meeting had been called. The message was simple. Mr. Adewale will address the village today. No drums. No celebration. No explanation. Just expectation. Samuel the steward stood near the front, arms crossed, jaw tight. For months now, his authority had been slipping through his fingers like sand. Decisions were questioned. His voice no longer ended arguments. And deep inside, fear had replaced arrogance. Who is this man? He wondered. And why does the village bend without knowing why? When Mr. Adewale finally appeared, there was no dramatic entrance. No convoy. No guards. No display of wealth. Just a man walking calmly into the square. He wore simple, clean clothes. His posture was relaxed. His eyes were steady. And then, a ripple moved through the crowd. Whispers followed. Confusion. Recognition. Disbelief. Because standing before them was not a stranger. It was Aderin. For a moment no one spoke. The silence stretched so long it felt uncomfortable. Kemi's breath caught in her throat. Teo took a step back. Baba Kunnal closed his eyes slowly, as if confirming what he had always known. And Samuel? Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. No, he whispered. This is not possible. Aderin stood still, letting the silence work for him. He had learned long ago that silence, when properly placed, carried more weight than shouting ever could. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, clear, unhurried. I left this village with nothing but questions, and I returned with answers. The villagers leaned in. He did not accuse. He did not insult. He did not raise his voice. He explained how he left in shame, how he learned, how he observed, how he built quietly step by step. He spoke of trade, of investments, of patience, of discipline. Then he said the words that froze the air. The projects that changed Ilodo, the wells, the loans, the trade routes, the partnerships, they were funded by my companies. Gasps spread across the square. He continued slowly, deliberately. I own logistics firms across multiple regions. I control supply chains that move millions in value each month. I hold equity in manufacturing, agriculture, and infrastructure. My net worth is measured not in thousands, but in billions. Not shouted, not bragged, simply stated. Aderin was a billionaire. Kemi covered her mouth. Teo stared at the ground. Some villagers dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in shock. Samuel staggered. No, you were nothing, he said, voice breaking. I accused you. You had no proof, no power. Aderin turned to him slowly. You were right, he said gently. I had no power then. That's why I learned how it really works. The words landed heavier than any insult. Baba Kunnal stepped forward, leaning on his staff. I told you, the old man said to the crowd, voice steady. The quiet ones hear what the loud ones miss. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at Aderin. You carried patience like a burden and turned it into a crown. Aderin looked around the village. The same paths, the same huts, the same river. I did not return for revenge, he said. I returned for closure. He paused. And to remind you, never measure destiny by current condition. The village understood then. They had mocked a future billionaire, ignored a strategic mind, crushed a seed before it sprouted. And now that seed stood taller than them all. Alodo did not return to normal after that day. How could it? Every familiar face now carried a new awareness. Every quiet child was watched differently. Every loud voice was questioned. The village had learned, too late, that destiny does not always announce itself with noise. Aderin stayed only a little while longer. Not to bask in attention. Not to collect apologies. Not to rewrite the past. But to complete the lesson. In the days that followed, he walked the same paths he once walked barefoot. He greeted the same people who once ignored him. Some avoided his eyes. Others bowed their heads. A few tried to apologize with words that felt rehearsed and late. Aderin accepted none of it with bitterness. Because bitterness, he had learned, is heavy, and he no longer carried unnecessary weight. He met privately with the elders. Long-term systems were discussed. Structures that would outlast his presence. Investments that would empower, not enslave. Accountability that would prevent men like Samuel from ever rising unchecked again. And when Samuel came, broken, humbled, stripped of arrogance, Aderin listened. He did not punish him. He simply removed his power. Influence without integrity is a debt, Aderin said calmly. And debts are always collected, eventually. That was the end of Samuel's reign. Quiet, final, deserved. Before leaving, Aderin visited the river one last time. The same river he once spoke to as a boy. The same water that listened when no one else did. He knelt, touched the surface and smiled. "We made it," he whispered, not with pride but with peace. Baba Kunnal stood behind him. "You were never invisible," the old man said. "They just didn't know how to see." Aderin nodded. "That's why I had to leave," he replied. "Some places can only understand growth after they feel the absence." When he finally departed, there was no announcement, no celebration, no farewell ceremony, just a quiet exit, just like the quiet rise that brought him there. But the lesson remained. The lesson: never mock the quiet one. Never underestimate the patient one. Never assume today's condition defines tomorrow's destiny. Some people are not loud because they are listening. Some people are not visible because they are building. Some people are not powerful yet, because power takes time. And sometimes, the boy you ignored, the girl you dismissed, the person you accused unfairly, is silently becoming everything you will one day depend on.